The city of Johannesburg in the early 20th century was a place of sharp contrasts. It was a city birthed from gold, where fortunes were made in the dirt and blood of the mines, and where ambition often blurred the line between survival and sin. Among the rows of red brick homes and hospital wards filled with the sick and wounded, a quiet nurse moved in the shadows. Her name was Daisy Louisa de Melker. Born Daisy Hancorn-Smith on June 1, 1886, in South Africa's Eastern Cape Province, her life began with little fanfare. Raised in a working-class family, Daisy's early years were marked by modesty and hardship. Her father, a railway employee, instilled in her a strong sense of discipline. After finishing her basic education, she trained as a nurse, an occupation that would eventually give her the means, the knowledge, and the opportunity to become one of South Africa's most infamous figures. Daisy married for the first time in 1909 to a plumber named William Cowell. Together, they had 5 children, but tragedy would soon stalk the family. 4 of the children died in infancy, an unfortunate but not entirely uncommon occurrence in the early 1900s, when child mortality was still high. However, the deaths would later be scrutinized in light of more sinister revelations. In 1914, the Cowells moved to the mining town of Germiston, where William ran a successful plumbing business. Though quiet and unassuming, Daisy had developed a reputation among neighbors as a woman of precision, organized to the point of obsession. She managed the household accounts meticulously, and when William fell ill in 1923, her caretaking skills were lauded. But William's death was sudden and unsettling. He had been in generally good health, suffering only from minor complaints, until he collapsed with severe convulsions and died shortly after. The official cause of death was listed as cerebral malaria, a diagnosis that satisfied the authorities at the time. What no one knew was that shortly before William died, Daisy had taken out a life insurance policy on him worth £1,795, a significant sum in those days. Grief-stricken but financially secure, Daisy moved on quickly. The following year, she married again, this time to another plumber, Robert Sproat. He, too, was in good health when they married, and like William, he also fell inexplicably ill within a few years. By 1927, Robert was dead. The cause? Once again, the symptoms pointed to something that looked like natural disease, stomach trouble, cramps, and violent seizures. As with her first husband, Daisy had insured Robert's life. She collected the payout, resumed her nursing work, and kept mostly to herself. But this second convenient death did not go unnoticed. Robert's younger brother, William Sproat, was not a man easily fooled. Suspicious of Daisy's windfall, and bitter that his brother's estate had been left entirely to her, he began to stir up questions that the police had, up to that point, failed to ask. Still, it wasn't until the death of her only surviving child that Daisy's carefully constructed world began to unravel. Rhodes Cowell was Daisy's son from her first marriage, a quiet, intelligent young man who had remained close to his mother. In 1932, he began complaining of persistent fatigue, headaches, and stomach pains. His condition worsened rapidly, and on March 5, he died, writhing in pain with symptoms eerily similar to those of both William and Robert before him. This time, the doctors weren't so quick to write it off as natural. Dr. J.C. Kemp, the pathologist who examined Rhodes' body, suspected poisoning. The autopsy confirmed it. High concentrations of arsenic were found in his system. It was the tipping point. The police launched a full investigation into Daisy de Melker's life, exhuming the bodies of both former husbands. The results were damning. Traces of strychnine were discovered in their remains, although not in sufficient concentration to support a definitive legal case. Still, suspicions became headlines. By May 1932, Daisy was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. The news sent shockwaves through the country. This quiet, demure nurse, a woman sworn to heal, was now accused of being a cold-blooded killer, a widow who had poisoned her way to financial security. Her trial would become one of the most sensational court cases in South African history. Held in Johannesburg Supreme Court, the trial began in October 1932. The prosecution, led by advocate Oswald Pirro, painted Daisy as calculating and remorseless. They argued that her medical knowledge enabled her to use poisons that mimicked common illnesses, thereby evading suspicion. Her choice of strychnine and arsenic, both painful and dramatic in effect, seemed to suggest not just a desire for gain, but an almost theatrical cruelty. The defense, however, presented a different Daisy, a devoted wife and mother, a woman victimized by coincidence and suspicion. They claimed that the deaths of her husbands were due to natural causes, and that Rhodes' death was a tragic accident, the result of self-administered medication or contamination. But it was too late. The evidence surrounding Rhodes' poisoning was overwhelming. The state presented receipts for arsenic purchases under false names, testimony from pharmacists, and handwriting analysis linking the poison to Daisy. Witnesses described her as secretive and emotionally detached, further damaging her defense. Even as her legal team struggled to shield her from the noose, another trial played out behind the scenes, a civil case initiated by William Sproat, challenging the legality of Robert's will. He sought to prove Daisy's influence over the will was illegitimate and demanded repayment of a loan allegedly given to Robert by his mother. Daisy refused to concede, claiming the money was a gift. She lost that case too. When the verdict was read on December 5, 1932, the courtroom fell silent. Daisy de Melker was found guilty, not for the murders of her husbands, but for the death of her only son. The judge, Mr. Justice Greenberg, sentenced her to death by hanging. She did not weep, nor did she plead. She simply stood in silence, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. By the time Daisy de Melker stood in the dock of the Johannesburg Supreme Court in October 1932, her name had become synonymous with death. She no longer bore the quiet anonymity of a nurse or widow, she was now the Black Widow of South Africa, a tabloid creation made flesh. Reporters filled every inch of the gallery, their ink-stained fingers racing to capture each whispered accusation. Outside, crowds surged against the courthouse steps, murmuring, praying, or jeering. The prosecution's case was not just built on poison, it was built on patterns. William Cowell, Robert Sproat, and Rhodes Cowell had all died under Daisy's roof, under her care, and under suspiciously profitable circumstances. But the court had only one charge to consider, the murder of her son, Rhodes. South African law, even in 1932, demanded proof beyond reasonable doubt. There was no room for conjecture about the husbands, not with their deaths so far in the past, and the evidence so eroded by time and decomposition. The judge had ruled early on that only the death of Rhodes would be placed before the jury. But to understand Daisy's possible motives, the prosecution skillfully painted a narrative of a mother whose love had been poisoned by greed. They argued that Rhodes, who had become increasingly independent and had recently taken employment at a factory, was on the verge of moving out, leaving Daisy alone in the house that had already buried 5 infants and 2 husbands. His death, the prosecution claimed, would not only silence a potential threat but would also grant Daisy another payout, albeit a much smaller one, from a policy she had taken out on his life. The key evidence came in fragments. The autopsy conducted by Dr. J.C. Kemp showed unmistakable traces of arsenic in Rhodes' liver and kidneys. It wasn't a dietary accident or environmental exposure. Someone had dosed him deliberately. Then came the testimony of pharmacist Herbert Ferguson, who recalled a woman resembling Daisy purchasing arsenic under a false name. A ledger containing her handwriting was presented, and an expert matched the entries to her script. Then a housekeeper testified to seeing Daisy preparing Rhodes' medicine and tea in the days before his death. It was subtle, but damning. The defense, led by advocate C.G. Millin, tried to chip away at the story's spine. They insisted there was no direct witness to Daisy administering poison. They suggested the pharmacist had misremembered. They floated the possibility that Rhodes had taken his own life. But those defenses rang hollow in the crowded courtroom. In reality, the most compelling witness may have been Daisy herself, or rather, her silence. Throughout the trial, Daisy maintained an eerie calm. Her answers were precise, her tone steady. She never protested loudly, never pleaded, never cried. She denied everything, but without passion. To some, she seemed stoic. To others, cold. It was as though Daisy had practiced for this moment all her life. A nurse's detachment, they said. Or a killer's. On December 5, 1932, after weeks of deliberation, Justice Greenberg delivered his verdict, guilty of the murder of Rhodes Cowell. The courtroom froze. There was no cheer, no cry, just the shifting of bodies in hard wooden benches. And then the sentence, death by hanging. The judgment sent shockwaves through South Africa. Daisy de Melker became only the second white woman in the country's history to receive the death penalty. The newspapers devoured the story. They printed grainy courtroom sketches, columns of moral outrage, and lurid speculation about how many others she may have killed. One paper labeled her a walking death sentence in a starched nurse's cap. But while the country debated, Daisy's world shrank to the cold confines of Pretoria Central Prison's death row. Her cell was bare, just a thin mattress, a small table, and bars that allowed light but no escape. Warders described her as polite but aloof, quietly reading the Bible or sitting in meditation for hours. She received no visitors. No friends, no family, no priest. It was said she preferred solitude. There were last-minute appeals. Her lawyer argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and subjective handwriting analysis. The defense pointed to Daisy's otherwise clean record, her years as a caregiver, her advanced age. But the appeals were dismissed without fanfare. The court had spoken, and so had the people. On December 30, 1932, at just after dawn, Daisy de Melker walked calmly to the gallows at Pretoria Central. She wore a simple grey dress, her hair neatly tied back. A matron held her arm, but Daisy did not stumble. Her last words, if any, were never recorded. The hangman, an officer imported from the United Kingdom for his discretion and efficiency, completed the execution within minutes. No public viewing. No photographs. The state would not allow her the martyrdom that some had feared she might claim. In the end, her body was buried in a pauper's grave near the prison walls. There was no headstone, no epitaph, no mourners. Just a patch of earth in a crowded field of the forgotten. But while Daisy vanished into the soil, her story refused to die. In the weeks following her execution, rumors spread. Had she killed all her children? Had she poisoned neighbors, too? Was she the first female serial killer in South African history, or just a scapegoat caught in a perfect storm of suspicion and misfortune? One fact was certain: William Sproat, the brother of her second husband and one of her earliest accusers, had won his civil case against her. He had managed to have Robert's will overturned. But the victory was hollow. With Daisy's legal costs mounting during the murder trial, every last asset had been sold off. William won the case but inherited nothing of value. And with Daisy's conviction limited to one charge, the courts never ruled conclusively on the deaths of her husbands. In the eyes of the law, she was not a serial killer, only a mother who murdered her son. But the public believed otherwise. Her reputation became legend, and her crimes the source of endless speculation. Some said she had mastered the art of the perfect murder, only to fail on the one she loved most. Others believed she had grown careless or desperate. Or perhaps she had always harbored a darkness that no one saw, hidden under starch-white linen and a nurse's soft voice. Time has a way of blurring the edges of even the most notorious crimes. But the story of Daisy Louisa de Melker, nurse, widow, mother, and convicted murderer, has not faded. If anything, the decades have sharpened the curiosity, inflamed the debate, and left behind more questions than answers. After her execution in 1932, Daisy's case became a ghost that haunted the South African public imagination. Newspapers that once chronicled her every courtroom glance now ran anniversary retrospectives. Writers, historians, and criminologists picked apart the trial records, seeking clarity on what still felt murky. The passage of time offered neither comfort nor conclusion. It only made the mystery more sinister. At the heart of the enduring fascination was this: Daisy had only been convicted of a single murder, her son, Rhodes Cowell. Yet suspicion clung to the deaths of 2 husbands and 5 children. Was she truly a serial killer in disguise, using the tools of her nursing profession to dispatch family members when they became inconvenient? Or had the state simply scapegoated a cold, solitary woman who had lived a life touched by death? Even before Rhodes' death, the string of tragedies in Daisy's life should have raised alarms. Her first husband, William Cowell, a plumber, died in 1923. His cause of death was registered as cerebral malaria. He left behind a £1,795 life insurance policy, an enormous sum at the time. Daisy collected it in full. Her second husband, Robert Sproat, died 5 years later in 1927, with similar symptoms: violent convulsions, foaming at the mouth. Again, the official cause was natural, gastroenteritis. Again, Daisy collected the payout. In both cases, their bodies were not exhumed until years later, well after Daisy was convicted for her son's death. By then, decomposition had done its work. No conclusive forensic evidence could be found. If strychnine had been used, as the prosecution initially alleged, its traces were long gone. These deaths remained technically unresolved. In fact, Daisy might never have been arrested if it weren't for one man, William Sproat, Robert's brother. It was William who grew suspicious, particularly when Daisy refused to return money she claimed was a gift, not a loan, from Robert's mother. His financial motivations may have tainted his credibility, but it was William who pushed for the investigation that would ultimately lead to Daisy's arrest. Without him, her story may have ended in quiet retirement rather than a hangman's noose. The public, meanwhile, was divided. Many viewed Daisy with horror, a cold, calculating woman who wore grief like a costume, poisoning those closest to her and calling it tragedy. Others saw a victim of circumstance, a mother punished for bad luck, bad timing, and bad optics. She was poor, widowed multiple times, and assertive in financial matters, a combination that drew suspicion in patriarchal society. What made the story all the more chilling was the method: poison. Arsenic and strychnine, old killers, silent and slow. There were no screams, no blood, no fingerprints. Just sudden illness, strange symptoms, and death. Poisoning, especially with substances like arsenic, was known as a woman's weapon: intimate, undetectable, and effective. Daisy had access to these substances through her work as a nurse, and she had knowledge of how they worked. Her background made her both capable and believable. After her death, rumors persisted. Stories circulated about secret diaries, hidden confessions, and a supposed lost manuscript written during her weeks on death row. But none of these were ever found. No note. No explanation. No remorse. Just silence. Her grave, too, became part of the myth. Buried in a pauper's plot at Pretoria Central Prison, her resting place was unmarked and unknown for years. Some claimed it was cursed. Others visited it as a morbid curiosity. Eventually, the exact site was lost to time. Yet her memory endured in strange places. South African schools and crime books referenced her as a cautionary tale. She became folklore, one of only 2 women ever hanged in the country's history. In 1988, more than 50 years after her death, the South African Police Service released files on her case to the public. These included trial transcripts, witness statements, and toxicology reports. Scholars pored over them, attempting to resolve what the courts could not. Several forensic experts, using modern techniques, attempted to analyze the old evidence. They focused particularly on the arsenic levels in Rhodes Cowell's body and whether accidental contamination was possible. The consensus remained, while some details were questionable, the pattern of behavior and the consistent financial motive were deeply incriminating. Still, the idea of Daisy as South Africa's first female serial killer was debated. Could she have endured so many personal losses without foul play? Could the deaths of 5 infant children, all under the age of 5, really be coincidence? Could 2 husbands with identical symptoms have died naturally, within 5 years of each other? And what about Rhodes? Why kill her only surviving child, the last connection to a family she had lost? The insurance policy was relatively small. Some theorized it wasn't about money, it was about control. Daisy had reportedly grown jealous of Rhodes' romantic relationship with a young woman. Perhaps she feared abandonment. Perhaps she couldn't bear to lose him to someone else. Alternatively, some speculated that Rhodes had uncovered secrets about the deaths of her previous husbands and confronted her, unknowingly sealing his fate. But these remained theories, suspicion dressed up as explanation. The only truth that survived was this: Daisy poisoned her son. The courts proved it. The gallows delivered judgment. Today, Daisy de Melker's name still carries weight in South African criminal history. Her story is taught in university criminology courses, dissected in true crime documentaries, and reimagined in theater productions and novels. Her image, a stern-faced woman in a wide-brimmed hat, has become iconic. In life, she was an unassuming nurse in the working-class suburbs of Johannesburg. In death, she became legend, a symbol of hidden darkness, maternal betrayal, and the terrifying idea that evil sometimes wears a nurse's uniform. Daisy's case endures not because we know the whole truth, but because we don't. Her silence at the end sealed her legacy, making her both a villain and a mystery. Each theory, each retelling, keeps the story alive, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most ordinary faces can mask the most extraordinary horrors. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. Please like this video, and subscribe to this channel for more content like this.